Hi class. Today it's time for Chapter 5 of The Janitor's Son, School Justice. Before we get started, do us a favor on this channel and please click the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and click the bell notification for future videos. Chapter 5, School Justice. Mr. Pike reported the ruined desk to the office over the music room intercom at the start of 8th period. Mr. Ackerby dropped what he was doing and hurried upstairs to take a look. He liked detective work, especially when the trail was fresh. The vice principal was on the case. Looking at the desk with Mr. Pike, Mr. Ackerby shook his head. Then, just to be polite, he asked, "So, Dave, got any suspects for me?" Mr. Pike seemed like he was always in his own wacky little music zone, so Mr. Ackerby didn't expect him to be much help. "Absolutely," said Mr. Pike. "Got it all figured out." Mr. Ackerby's eyebrows shot up. "Really?" Like Jack, Mr. Ackerby didn't understand that a good choral director notices everything. Mr. Pike nodded and said, "Clear as a bell. I've got 56 students in that 7th period class, and they're on the absence list today. 3 on the absence list today, so 53 were here. I make the kids fill the room from front to back, and there are 51 chairs in the first 4 rows. I always look up to see who's late when the bell rings, and today Carrie Lomas and Jack Rankin were almost tardy. They had to be the only kids sitting on the last row today. I wouldn't think either of them would do this, but they were back there, I'm sure of that." As he returned to the office, Mr. Ackerby revisited his opinion of Mr. Pike. Then he looked up the class schedules for Lomas, Carey, and Rankin Jack. Isn't that like those teachers when you were in school who were always watching to see who would be late to class? So you knew which teachers you could be late for and which ones you couldn't be late for. As he returned to the office, Mr. Ackerby revisited his opinion of Mr. Pike. Oh, okay, I've already read that. Okay. 5 minutes later, Mr. Ackerby had a quick conversation with the Lomas girl in the hallway outside her social studies class. Mr. Ackerby could tell she was innocent. So it had to be the Rankin boy. Someone was about to learn that there is no such thing as the perfect crime, especially at school, and he was going to learn it the hard way. About 20 minutes into 8th period, Mr. Ackerby appeared at the doorway of Jack's English class. He said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Carroll, I need to have a word with Jack Rankin." Jack knew. Sounds like somebody's in trouble here. He knew why Mr. Ackerby wanted to talk with him. Okay. And please be patient with me. I'm having some technical issues with my mouse. As if in a fog, Jack got up from his desk and walked through the silent room, his face chalky white, his mouth dry. One look at Mr. Ackerby was sure he had his man. Mr. Ackerby closed the door to the classroom and glared down into Jack's pale face. Jack couldn't look him in the eye. Without raising his voice, Mr. Ackerby said, "Jack, I'd like you to walk down to the music room and bring a folding desk back to my office for me." Jack gulped. Weakly, lamely, hopelessly, he asked, "Which desk?" Mr. Ackerby's eyes flashed and he said, "Hold out your hands." Oh boy, it sounds like something a teacher would do when they get ready to paddle you. Jack raised his hands up to about his waist, and Mr. Ackerby said, "Higher and palms up." Leaning forward, Mr. Ackerby sniffed the left hand and then the right one. Watermelon. Pointing at Jack's right hand, he said, "Bring me the desk that smells like that." It was a long way to the music room. Jack was tempted to dash down the stairway and out the door and just keep running and running, but he knew he couldn't. Mr. Pike was rehearsing with the seventh grade. Okay. Chorus. He looked up from his music stand when Jack came in. He shook his head and gave Jack a frown, but he didn't miss a beat. Jack grabbed the desk and made his way awkwardly back out the door. As he walked to the office, Jack's mind filled with images of the horrors to come. By the time he arrived at Mr. Ackerby's doorway, the desk seemed to weigh about 300 pounds. Mr. Ackerby was sitting on a bookcase by the window in his office, waiting. Pointing with a stubby index finger, he showed where he wanted the desk and motioned Jack into a chair. Then he walked over and tipped the folding desk onto its side so they could both get a good look at the incredible mess on the bottom. The office filled up with the heavy scent of the gum. Mr. Ackerby shook his head. "Look at that! Unbelievable! What in the world could you have been thinking? Tell me, Jack. What were you thinking?" Mr. Ackerby had not had time to read Jack's school record, so he didn't know that Jack was a pretty good student and had never been in any real trouble at the elementary school. At this moment, all Mr. Ackerby knew was that this kid in blue jeans and a black t-shirt had worked pretty hard to destroy a desk. And whenever he caught someone damaging property, Mr. Ackerby didn't have to pretend to be angry. It was the real thing. Jack looked steadily at the man's brown necktie and tried not to flinch. Jack could smell the man's shampoo, his shaving cream, his aftershave lotion, the ham and mustard sandwich he had eaten for lunch, and the mint he was sucking on. Jack was angry at his dad, and he was angry at himself, and he hated the way things were spinning out of control. He clenched his jaw and worked very hard to keep his eyes from filling with tears. Jack had been asked a question, and Mr. Ackerby didn't like waiting. He leaned forward and spoke even louder. "I demand an answer, young man. Look at this mess. What were you thinking?" Jack glanced at the desk, then into Mr. Ackerby's squinty eyes, and then back to his ugly necktie. Jack couldn't quite explain that question to himself, not clearly. And there was no way he was going to open up and try to explain all his feelings to this guy. So Jack said, "I don't know. I just did it," as if he could not believe what he was hearing. Mr. Ackerby bent his face down close to Jack's and repeated, "You just did it? Well, you know what, buddy boy? You're going to just undid it." He turned on his heel and after a couple of quick steps sat down at his desk with a thump. Mr. Ackerby grabbed a pen and began writing a note on a stationery pad. He finished it, ripped it off, sealed it in an envelope, and began writing again. He said, "I'm sending a note home to your parents, and I'll be putting a memo in your permanent file. And starting today, you can cancel all your after-school plans. Mr. Ackerby ripped the second piece of paper off the notepad, sealed it in another envelope, then stood up and walked over to Jack. Handing him the first envelope, he said, "This is for you to take home to your parents. Get it signed, bring it back tomorrow." Turning around, he nudged the desk with the toe of his brown shoe. "You take this ruined desk down to the janitor's workshop in the basement by the boys' gym. Then get back to your class." Mr. Ackerby paused and handed Jack the second envelope. "Immediately, after school, you go back to the workshop and you hand this envelope to the chief custodian, and you tell him you have volunteered for after-school gum patrol, an hour a day for the next 3 weeks. Now get going." School justice, exactly the way Mr. Ackerby liked it, swift and certain. As Jack lugged the smelly desk through the empty hallways and then down the stairs into the workshop, he was praying no one would be there, and no one was. He set the desk in the middle of the room and ran back up the stairs. He got to his English class just as the bell was ringing. He copied the assignment off the board, picked up his books, and went to social studies. All during ninth period, Jack fretted and worried. He wondered how much his dad would yell at him. He wondered if his mom would ground him. He wondered if something like this in his file would keep him from playing football when he got to high school. And he wondered if Mr. Ackerby had any idea that the chief custodian was his dad. Jack felt stupid for getting caught, and even worse, now he'd have to be the junior janitor for 3 whole weeks. There was no way out. If anyone in the school hadn't figured out that John, the janitor, was his dad, they wouldn't be left out of the secret for long. And, of course, there was only one person to blame for the whole mess. Jack clenched his teeth and pressed his lips together, barely containing an urge to spit. And he thought, "Thanks again, Dad." Wow, he blames his dad again. It's like his dad can do no wrong, and all he's doing is just making a living to help support his son Jack. Wow. Sometimes kids growing up can be very ungrateful. But I'm sure at some time at the end of, before the end of the story, I'm hoping that he'll realize that he's got it all wrong and that his dad is the main one that cares about him, certainly more than his friends. Next time on Chapter 6, Reporting for Duty. So, if you haven't already, click the like and subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on the rest of this book class, I can guarantee you. I'm having so much fun reading this, and I hope that you're enjoying the story so far. Chapter 5 was so much fun. Okay, and click the bell notification so you can be informed of future videos. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time, Lord willing. Bye.